Thank you. It's, what a great venue this is. It's terrific, actually. You know, I was going to start with a joke, but I have to tell you truth first because truth is stranger than fiction because fiction has to make sense. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were just packing up her Subaru to go to the airport to fly over to Honolulu for the American Psychological Association convention, and it was about 95 degrees in eastern Washington at the time, and the handbrake was set on the Subaru with a very, very slight incline on our long driveway. And as I put the 65-pound or so suitcase in there, at least it seemed like it weighed that much, I went back in to get more. It slowly began to back itself down the driveway. Now, there's also a lawn, which is little bit of a downgo, so it goes off onto the lawn, turns itself around, and goes forward, okay? Now, it's only about another 75 feet gaining speed before we get to a 20-foot rock cliff that goes onto the highway. So, it gets to the rock cliff and off onto the highway. Luckily, nobody was there, but according to people who stopped instead of driving into it, it bounced off the nose, and as it bounces off the nose, the deck lid closes, carefully preserving the suitcase and all the rest of the stuff. It then bounces back on the tail, back on the nose, and parks itself almost perfectly parallel, halfway off the road in the opposite direction. So I get down there, and I look at it, and there's no glass. It hasn't rolled over. So I get in, take the brake off, and drive it back up the house, change suitcases. It is total. I might say it is total. It didn't sound too good getting up there, but but that's the truth of it all. So anyway. I got interested in rest before it was called rest out of my work in hypnosis. Most of my publications are in hypnosis, but I've been publishing in rest between the 1970s and early 1990s, roughly. So we're going to go back to the original starting things here and just kind of give you flavor for some of this, because it shows you how hypnosis can improve performance in a lot of areas, and how rest itself is adjunctive, not just by itself, in helping precipitate positive effects from other kinds of treatments. So there was a time back in the 70s when, one of the biggest impediments to using hypnosis with patients was the fact that not everybody is hypnotizable. It's an ability, it's about 70% genetic, and about 5–10% aren't hypnotizable. A bunch of people aren't terribly hypnotizable. Most people are in the middle. It's almost normally distributed and so on. So the problem is that we want to increase hypnotizability. Well, a guy named John Zubek at McGill University published a book, I believe, 1969. Peter Zubel will correct me if I'm wrong on remembering that date. University of Manitoba. Thank you. That was, that had a little section in it on how sensory deprivation would increase responsiveness to suggestion. Of course, it didn't actually measure hypnotizability, so I thought, well, I've got to do this. Unfortunately, at the time, there were a number of studies that came out in the hypnosis literature where it was said that basically if you do an experiment with sensory deprivation, because you call it sensory deprivation, people are going to fake their scores, not intentionally, but it's going to be an effect of the setting. It was told it was sensory deprivation. So I wanted to find a setting that would be where we weren't calling it sensory deprivation, but yet we had an isolation effect. Another thing was coming out was this idea that there was a correlation between waking eyes closed alpha, and it turns out it's actually high theta and low alpha EEG, and hypnotizability, but some guy by the name of Dumas, actually working out of Jack Hilgard's lab, published this paper on, well, it's entirely due to volunteering. So people who volunteer for studies give you that correlation, but people who are drafted don't. I didn't believe that, but so I thought we better study this. So now I have to find drafted subjects who aren't really drafted, who don't think they're drafted, and I have to find an isolation situation to see whether or not it increases hypnotizability without telling them in a hypnosis experiment. Now we have this pesky thing in Canada and the United States called the Human Subjects Committee, or the Institutional Review Board, or whatever it is. I served on that, by the way. What I'm going to do when I retire at 70, by the way, is I'm going to take one of the old Nazi experiments and I'm going to put it in the proper language, and I'm going to run it through the IRB, and I'm willing to bet that we can get one of those through, but we have trouble getting a sensory deprivation study through. So the answer there was, what I'll do is I'll propose this to the National Science Foundation. So they have this division of polar biology and medicine, and they accept papers from psychologists. And, well, they accept the submission, but they actually don't fund psychology. They only fund polar biology and medicine. So I couldn't get NSF to fund this thing. So now I've got to find some place to make NSF fund this, because they're the outfit that supplies logistics through the US Navy and so forth to get to Antarctica. So the answer is, I send my vita to all of the universities in New Zealand. And curiously enough, the University of Canterbury on the South Island, which is the jumping off point for Antarctica for US logistics, hires me. Little did they know that I was going to be doing this. So shortly thereafter, what I discovered was the fact is that part of the trade for letting them use Christchurch and letting all these Yanks invade the place, is that they have to give them free logistics for the New Zealand Scott base, which is like only 10 people, 60 people in the summer, whereas McMurdo was the US base is 700 to 1,000. Big difference. So it doesn't cost them much. So this was the trick. I put it through the New Zealand process, which was no trouble at all. And because they wanted somebody to do physiological work down there, so I could do that, so that was fine. So they got what they wanted, and I was able to do the hypnosis part at the same time. So this is how we actually forced NSF to fund my project. So it's so what we have is, does isolation, rest in fact, as we properly termed it, thanks to Peter Sudfeld, enhance hypnotizability? Just increase a person's ability to respond to hypnosis, which is great for pain. Hypnosis is NIH approved for pain. It works as well as a lot of chemical analgesics, and better than some, for example, and very good for a lot of other things as well. We'll talk to you later about using hypnosis for adjunctively as part of the abreactive cure for PTSD, which we have 2 placebo-controlled studies. We can do it in 6 hours with hypnosis now. How about that? We'll talk to you about that later. And how can we mask the subject? Well, it turns out that when you are a wintering over person at Scott Base, whether you're a cook, you're a person who goes and checks machines for data collection and writes these things down, does these things, you automatically volunteer for any studies that are going on. So they're already drafted. So they don't even, they have no choice, which is ideal, And we don't have any pesky IRB to put up with either, The only rule is you have to debrief them after the experiment. But curiously enough, at the time, they didn't even say how long after. Some of these people still don't know they were in this experiment, So anyway, this is what Scott Base looked like back in 1975, 76. And that's the EEG machine we used to see how much it was, to measure the alpha and so forth. And that was supplied by the Sanii company from Japan, who we traded sheep pelts to for this, by the way. And they're very happy to do that. And they advertised all this stuff down there. Look how tough our equipment is, because it survived Antarctica. And actually, it did survive amazingly well, because the US Navy dropped the box off the end of a front loader into a lot of other equipment, and it did actually survive quite well. At least none of the subjects complained about being shocked or anything like that. So that is the hallway on the right, which is about 4 inches of ice in it. And the labs are, the hallway is not heated, as you can tell. And the labs just go off from one part of the hallway, sleeping areas and so forth. So basically, you would run on your normal Antarctic clothing, sweaters and wool pants and so on, from one lab to the other. And basically the game was, somebody who was fully dressed to go outside would stop and start a conversation up with you, and you're supposed to be tough and not be bothered that it's 40 degrees below zero. And down in the lower left-hand corner, it was the only country then still using dog sleds. And the passenger there in the huge red outfit actually was the Secretary of the Navy at the time, Middendorf. And the New Zealanders were going to play, and we have now 60 photographers. It cost $50,000 then to bring people there. We had 50 plus photographers from the United States taking pictures of Middendorf. So the Kiwis decided, my good friends decided, they're going to set him up and let him try and drive the dog sled. Now the dog sled people in New Zealand aren't terribly great. And he just said, well, I guess I could try. Anyway, he did perfect figure eights. It turned out he had spent quite a bit of his life in Alaska. So he had no trouble with dogs at all. He gave out this shrieking whistle. And so I clapped for our side, and New Zealanders are very depressed about that. And the slide on the right there, in the bottom right corner, that's me and Captain Nordhill, who was the head of Detachment Delta. He was also a good fun pilot to fly with. So that's Mount Erebus. That's the huge mountain near Scott Base and McMurdo that New Zealand Airlines crashed a DC-10 full of paying passengers into. I actually wrote an article suggesting that they shouldn't conduct these flights because DC-10s do not make low-level, good sightseeing aircraft. But it wasn't. People didn't pay attention to it. That's one of our planes. It's a C-130 ski plane landing, and some little background there. And that's a Weddell seal on the right. And they get fed to the dogs. And unfortunately, they just walk up and club them over the head, and that's the end of that. And they have special permission environmentally to do that. So anyway, let's get back to the data here. So the big thing is I won't bore you with all the data because we know this, you won't be able to see the numbers anyway there, but Antarctic wintering over isolation did increase hypnotizability, and we used a scale that didn't involve direct hypnotic induction with it. And it was a significant increase. So we discovered there is a link between isolation and increasing hypnotizability because a person gets to be more internally oriented when they might not be otherwise. That's how they put up with it. Isolation in the winter is basically they're anosmic to all odors except the odors in the base, which are cooking odors and some restroom odors, if you will, and that's about it really. And they have 24 hours of darkness during the winter, so there is quite a bit of isolation going on. We also did alpha EEG density increases there. I had a really good picture of that, but I don't know what happened to it. We actually practiced in a prison in New Zealand because the space was for three of us to work, my two technicians and myself plus the subject. We had very limited space to work in, so we spent a lot of time doing that. So now that we have it established and we know the drafting doesn't make that much difference, it was now time to see whether we can do something practical that'd be useful clinically. So this is my lab at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. That's also the EEG machine. So we measured in this particular study. This is 6 hours of rest. And we did this back in the late 70s. And we measured skin conductance and peripheral skin temperature and core temperature, and we did EEG measures so we could do the alpha density and measure theta and a lot of other things like that. We had my assistant there, Kate Abelson, after we'd closed the door. By the way, we used female subjects because they have better bladder capacity than males, so the ones that can actually last 6 hours. Great attention to detail here. So we took nursing students, and they all did fine with that. As we closed the second double-handled door, which are basically these are doors they use like on freezers, kind of things. Kate would look at me and say, "Well, do you think she'll crack?" And so we monitored what craving for stimulation. They'd push a button if they were getting bored, and we'd give them stock market quotes. The same 3 stock market quotes over and over again. So we had a criteria for removing them from rest in case they were having a real problem. So we had 3 criteria. They had to show 3 criteria for craving for stimulation. Someone would feel and try to count the little holes in the acoustic tile, and then the people would go for the stock market quotes. Basically, the remarkable thing is we only took one person out at about 5 hours instead of 6 hours. So we didn't have this horrible effect that we were told was going to happen from sensory deprivation, and they came out and said they really liked it. Now, the interesting thing here is we measured this with a real hypnotizability scale, one that had just come out at Stanford called the Stanford Hypnotic Clinical Scale, and it was only 5 points. We embedded that scale in dozens of other measures. So it wasn't like the primary focus, the idea that they couldn't complain about the study. People figuring out it was about hypnosis because it was a hypnotizability scale, because it was just one of many, many, many scales they took. And then we measured them before we took them out of the chamber. And then we measured them 10 days to 14 days later. And also, the idea is, well, of course, anybody can, after saying, well, in your hands are feeling like there's magnets attracted to each other and they're moving closer, and anybody can fake that and they kind of figure out what you want to do. So we thought we better have a real criteria. Well, so we added a pain suggestion for increased pain tolerance and used a shock device. And the incredible thing is, for pain tolerance, this thing would only go to 900 volts. I mean, we're talking, we put on the back of the hand would actually go out like this. And we had people that exceeded pain tolerance with the suggestion for increased pain tolerance. They would feel their hand would be entirely anesthetized, be like leather, as if the electrodes were sitting on top of leather, with that hypnotic suggestion after. So we had the pre and post measures. We also did something called pain threshold, which turns out to be a real problem in terms of really measuring it. So here's the data. The scale is the Stanford Hypnotic Clinical Scale, is a 5-point scale, but I wanted to make the graph look really nice. So if you just multiply the pain threshold and tolerance scores by 10, you can put it all in the same graph. The point was, the pain threshold, there was no change in pain threshold at all. And that's kind of a bogus measure, because we don't know what a pain threshold to one person is not to another person. That's been abandoned in the literature. We use things called ischemic pain and cold pressor pain now. But the thing is, hypnotizability went up from 1.7 average score, mean score, to in excess of, it was actually 4.2. It says 4.0 there. It was actually 4.2 in this first study. And it was maintained at 10 days to 2 weeks. So once they learned this skill, they were actually able to do this, which is pretty neat. We actually tested me on this, by the way, years later in my lab at the University at Washington State University, using the 12-point scale. And the scale that's 12 points is this is the Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Scale. And there's a lot of research on this. This is actually the work that Hilgard did over 20 years at Stanford. It helps to be dean first. Then you can do he made his name in behavioral research, in learning theory, became dean, and then gave himself the funding and the building to do the hypnosis research. So it's something he always wanted to do, actually. He said it really helps to be able to do that. And so they developed these great scales that are very reliable, that you can use, but they're good for research settings. They're not very good for clinical settings, so they take over an hour. But one of these items is called anosmia to ammonia, and you take this bottle of ammonia and you tell the person in hypnosis, after you've been exposed to hypnosis and they've already passed these other items, that they're going to have, they won't be able to smell any odors at all. Now take a whiff of this, and you put this ammonia directly underneath their nose. Now take a big whiff of this, Well, my score on that scale was about 2. I was terrible. But since this sensory deprivation thing worked, I figured, it took me 10 years before I figured I'd actually do myself. So they ran me as a subject. So we got to that particular item 9 on the Stanford scale. Well, I knew what the item was, even though I was hypnotized, responding to this thing. So I thought my graduate students were completely putting me on. So I opened my eyes, and sure enough, it actually was the ammonia. So I was quite amazed, actually, because my expectation was that was a fake, and it really came out pretty well. So pretty interesting. Anyway, that's the hypnosis part, which we used to call animal magnetism. And so you have, it's a downside of animal magnetism, I guess. Let's move on in time here to dry floatation, use of dry floatation measures for increasing performance like marksmanship. In this particular study, we used 24 students enrolled in a marksmanship training class at Washington State University. And we had nine males and 3 females in each group. And these folks were pretty much plateaued at a score of very continuous scores before we started them. In other words, it wasn't like an intramural group of people shooting for fun. These were ROTC folks that were really trying to get up. And they'd pretty much plateaued. We had really good people, bad people, kind of in between. And so this is pretty where. So we were able to match the groups for within 3 points, and then expose them to rest. We use dry flotation. The one advantage of dry flotation rest is that it's a terrific interim method to get people. I had both a wet tank at the time, dry tank, and also we still have a chamber in my laboratory. I'll be retiring soon, so my lab is in the process of closing, so I'm actually selling my dry flotation tank now. The advertisement for that's out there. The The deal with this is the dry flotation tank comes with a lot of frills that people like, which have nothing to do with rest. I mean, this tank that I have, the dry flotation tank, has a underwater spa type water jets that go up and down your back if you hook it up to spa equipment. It has these fabulous Danish stereo speakers in it. It has sand-filled walls. The sound vibration damping is really good. It's a super low tactile kind of plush material that sits over the top of it. So there are people who would never get into the wet tank. You get into this thing and you say, but there's something even more. And by the time they do this, they're more likely to get into the wet tank. We've had some of those little transition things. We didn't publish that though. It's kind of interesting. With the dry flotation, we warm the water to not roughly 92, 93 degrees we do in wet rest, but roughly about 95 Fahrenheit for doing that because you've got more of your body's exposed to the air. And then we use this negative ion generated charcoal filtered air, just like you do in a lot of the wet tanks as well. So a lot of that's exactly the same. That's what it looks like. And that's finished in lemon oil, so you don't have any petroleum byproducts evaporating inside the room or inside the actual chamber. And this is a deal for performance on top. It's a piece of tempered glass where you can put video. So if you want to demonstrate golf or proficient race driving and that kind of thing. I did that before I ran the Formula Atlantic race at National Championship race for myself, and actually, unfortunately, imprinted on a guy that was slower than me. Yeah, but we won anyway. But nonetheless, it was and that's what it looks like. That's the speakers for the front. And as the subject can adjust the amount of ventilation and can adjust they can actually turn the lights on with the dimmer if they want to at any time. So it's an environment which is a pretty inviting environment compared to some of the other ones. Good transition environment, and works. It replicates the results we get with chamber rest, which you cannot obtain with with wet rest in some cases, like hypnotizability changes and some other things. There's the Danish speakers in the back end of it. So the control condition, by the way, we wanted to use a control condition which is a really legitimate control condition. And I think most people know that hypnosis, although hypnosis does not require relaxation, there's probably 100 studies, well, maybe 200 now, in tier 1 journals like International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis, Journal of Abnormal, which just show that it gives tremendously effective relaxation effects. So our control condition was actually a relaxation condition, and then we gave them some BS from how relaxation enhances your marksmanship performance, which isn't really told to BS, which was basically just information on that. And we just used so we could replicate this. We just read the induction from the Stanford Clinical Scale, which takes less than 5 minutes to read the hypnotic induction for that. And it's a, progressive relaxation, kind of Joseph Wolpe, let your right foot relax, your left foot relax, and moving on up through your body. So it's a lot of effect there. Now, the experimental group was, I'm looking at the salt replica here, and it's giving me a PTSD, traumatic response to cleaning up my lab every time the pool people would come by. Washington State University was plagued by the pool inspection people coming by at random intervals as well, so constantly they're trying to clean up the salt. But hence my fascination with dry flotation rest for a period. Anyway, we'd orient them to the dry flotation chamber, and they were only exposed to 50 minutes of dry rest. This was in an unlighted condition. There was no attempt to provide video or any of this imagery or any of that other sort of stuff during or after rest. And they were simply assessed within 48 hours. And what actually happened then was it was all done under the ROTC supervisor's instructions, and then the shots were fired from the same unsupported prone positions, all carefully controlled. We used these national competition targets and so on. Then the targets were scored by these ROTC cadet instructors, but they did not know who was in the experimental group and who was in the control group, which is the way you're supposed to do this. So here's what actually happened is the rest condition, only 50 minutes of rest, one exposure, at least within a couple-day period, showed marksmanship improvements in people who had already plateaued on marksmanship. That's the important thing. They're already plateaued. They weren't improving anymore as a result of instruction. So that's pretty cool. Peter Sudfeld did a basketball study, and we did a basketball study. So this is a dissertation by Jeffrey Wegeman at WSU, and we had 22 expert collegiate basketball players from what was then Pac-10 team WSU, and then also the University of Idaho. That's only about 9 miles from Washington State University. So we consider these are really expert players, and we had all sorts of objective scores. We had coaches that didn't know who had rest and who did not have the rest condition. This is kind of an interesting study as well. The student in question wound up being put on probation for doing this. It drew so much excitement that he got a newspaper inquiry, and he revealed the name of one of the people in the study. It turned out to be Brian Quinnett. I'm going to reveal it again because it's already been revealed. This is not new news. Who managed to score, after 1 hour in rest, 60 points in one game. 60 points. By the way, Washington State University still had the ability to grasp defeat from the jaws of victory by putting in people after that who hadn't been allowed to play before, and we still lost by 4 points. Yes, we can only do that at Washington State University. It's remarkable, Anyway, I think Brian's retired from the NBA now, but he gave anyway. The release thing was, University of Washington watch out because WSU has a tank, and of course it was downhill from there. So anyway, we did another study. It was a tennis performance study, and this was Patrick McElhaney was the PhD student on that one, and we had significantly improved game performance, and this is also measured in intercollegiate competition. And we used imagery plus rest versus imagery alone, because the imagery condition also had some positive effects as well. So that's pretty neat stuff. Last one, here we go. So the dry flotation study, this increased hypnotizability and pain control. This is the first study that actually used dry flotation rest for increasing hypnotizability. Wet flotation rest did not work for that. We tried it in 4 or 5 different experiments, had no significant results. Apparently, wet rest is perhaps too much fun. I don't know. We tried lighted and unlighted conditions, and one of the problems with long periods of rest, like 6 hours in a darkening condition, people will fall asleep and you lose the rest effects. So we tested lighted and unlighted conditions, and we used the Stanford hypnotizability test scores again, test before and after, and a 2 weeks follow-up, very much like we did in the New Zealand study. And we used a much better measure of pain to use the pain criteria. It's called ischemic pain. This is a deal where you put the blood pressure cuff on the subject and you inflate it to, 240 millimeters of mercury, something like that, And then you have them squeeze a hand dynamometer to 10 kgs. Anyway, this creates a very painful situation, which is considered to be similar to post-operative pain. And you'll ask the person to report over a minute, like on a 1 to 10, where 10 is a point where you'd like us really to take the cuff off, Tell us how you're doing. So 1, 2. The people who were not in the rest condition, 3, 4, 5, and 10. Oh, please keep on reporting. Most people can do this. 12, 13. People in the rest condition with the pain tolerance increase. We had people that had these kinds of scores over that minute and a half. You can't leave it on much longer. You do tissue damage. Not a good thing. Blood vessel damage. We try to take good care of our subjects and minimize the tissue damage. So the interesting thing is, again, the dry flotation rest increased hypnotizability and pain tolerance. It had with this idea of pain reduction with rest by itself hasn't been tied into this kind of work, and that was kind of one of the things we're going to do next. So running low on time here, I'll plug my books. The left one is my hypnotherapeutic techniques book, which is now the national text for medical schools in Romania as well, translated in Romanian. It's with John G. Watkins, who a lot of you have heard about. He just passed away about a year ago at 98. The next one is the Advanced Hypnotherapy book, which is the more psychodynamic one, and then the one that's just came out in 2010 is the Medical Hypnosis primer for people who don't know anything about hypnosis. So there we are.